Hi, my name is Lillian Rodriguez, and today I will be presenting Trifle, written by Susan Glaspell. Trifles is a story written in the early 1900s by Miss Glaspell, and it indicates a married couple who husband is a farmer, Mr. John Wright, and his wife, Miss Minnie Wright, lived on a farm, and basically they do not interact with other individuals or neighbors, family, or friends. They are pretty much isolated in their own world or life. And one day, Miss Wright is found sitting on her rocking chair, and Mr. Wright is found upstairs in his bedroom, dead. Upon finding Mr. Wright upstairs in his bedroom dead, and Minnie Wright downstairs on the rocking chair, the question becomes, who committed the murder? Hale, who is the gentleman that stopped by the home to visit and actually discovers the body, in the film that we watch by Alfred Hitchcock, he invites Miss Wright to come along with him to his home so he can call in the murder to the authorities, since Mrs. Wright does not have a phone in her home. Miss Wright is extremely happy and excited that she actually gets an opportunity to interact with other individuals, and actually excited to go to Hale's home. Upon Hale arriving with Mrs. Wright to his home, he calls in the murder, and you see that after the murder is called in, the county attorney comes back to visit the murder scene along with the sheriff, Mrs. Hart, and Mrs. Peters. As the two gentlemen go upstairs to visit the murder scene and to actually start looking for clues as to how the murder happened and who may have committed it, you see Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters in the bottom pretty much talking about Minnie Wright and her life. However, as they start speaking and as the film develops, or the story develops, a variety of clues and evidence found by Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters in Trifle lead us to believe Minnie is responsible for killing her husband. I will talk about those clues in the next slides. Some of the clues that are identified in the story Trifle that indicate Minnie actually committed the murder are as follows. Minnie does not report her husband's murder. She is found sitting on a rocking chair. However, and she's aware that her husband has died. However, at no point does she discuss or contact anyone regarding her husband's murder. The kitchen is found out of order or in disarray. The quilt stitches that Minnie was working on are in an unusual disarray or pattern. A dead bird is found in a box hidden amongst Minnie's stitching items. Minnie's life with her husband, John Wright, which we'll discuss each of these bullet points in the next slides. The first clue that would indicate Minnie may have been responsible for her husband's murder is she did not report the murder. In the first scene, as I mentioned earlier, Minnie is found by Hale and in a rocking chair, quiet, unfocused, and in a frenzied state of mind. Minnie appears to be almost mentally ill when she is found by Hale. In the film Trifle, presented by Alfred Hitchcock, Minnie tells Hale John is upstairs and allows Hale to walk upstairs to the bedroom, although Minnie is extremely aware that John is actually dead upstairs. When Minnie is questioned by Hale as to what happened, who committed the murder, Minnie admits to sleeping in a bed with Mr. Wright, but she doesn't know how it happened because she didn't wake up. She's a sound sleeper, quote unquote, according to Minnie. She states she's unaware of hearing anything, and she's just not sure how her husband died. The next clue that leads me to believe Minnie may have committed the murder is the kitchen's found out of order. The kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen, and left without having been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incomplete work. As I mentioned earlier, this story takes place in the early 1900s, and actually in that era, the women stayed home and took care of the home inside as the husbands worked, and in this case, Mr. Wright was a farmer. Finding the home in such a disarray was just unusual. As Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters continue to discuss the way they found the home and discuss Minnie Wright further, they discover the quilt pieces Minnie was working on. As you see here in the quote, it says, "Here, this is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even. And look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about." What this leads me to believe is that at some point Minnie either became nervous, unfocused, and at such a time lost her pattern or began stitching in a not correct way, as the quote states. As Miss Hale and Miss Peters continue to look around the home, Miss Peters discovers a bird cage in a cupboard. She asks Miss Hale if she recalls the Wrights owning a bird, and unfortunately Miss Hale is unable to answer that question since she admits that she did not have enough time to visit the Wrights. After all, Mr. Wright did not like visitors. They continue to speak and at some point get curious and look under the quilted items. They find a box that it looks very nice and catches their eye. As they look in the box, open it up and look inside, there they find a dead bird, which catches their breath, and at this point can start seeing the connection and assume that this bird belonged to Mrs. Wright. The bird has been strangled, same way that Mr. Wright was found dead. So as you start to connect the dots, it's more apparent to see that the murderer in this film or story is leaning towards Miss Minnie Wright.